Good evening to my people of Bear Point Free Will Baptist Church. This is our Wednesday evening Bible study online tonight, of course, because of the bitter cold and the snow that we got today. This has been absolutely the most demoralizing winter since I've started at Bear Point. This is our sixth one, and I say it's demoralizing. I mean, I still feel okay. I mean, it is definitely psychologically damaging week in and week out to deal with this kind of weather and the cold temperatures. And I mean, that ice from January was definitely abnormally difficult. And but God is still good. We're still able to do things online, so I'm thankful for that. I definitely miss meeting in person. We always eat on Wednesday night, and that's always a joy. And I miss that, and hopefully we'll get to do that again next week. But this again is better than nothing. And if you're not, if you don't tune in with us week in and week out, we're on 2 Kings chapter 2 and verse 19 tonight. If you want to go ahead and turn there, and I'll talk a little bit to give you a chance to do that and for people to find this. This is pre-recorded. It's early afternoon, and I'm going to put this on the Facebook Live at 6:30 tonight, or put it on Facebook. It won't be live. But YouTube is a better option for us, and we will do YouTube Live eventually, I think. But right now we just do Facebook Live for Sunday mornings, and then I've transitioned us whenever we do Bible studies due to cold and weather to do them on YouTube and then share them to our Facebook page. And so that seems to work a lot better. My father says he can hear a lot better from YouTube, and I think the quality is better. So this is not live, but it's our evening Bible study. And in fact, I can actually respond in real time if there are any questions or comments or prayer requests in the comments section below if you want to do that, because I'll be able to watch this along with everybody else at 6:30 tonight. So 2 Kings, we've been working through the Kings books for over a year now, verse by verse. We don't do every single study that way, but it's definitely probably the most beneficial way to study the Bible. I don't think there's too much controversy in saying that. So we're doing Peter verse by verse on Sunday nights and Kings verse by verse on Wednesday nights. Both books in both cases, 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Peter. And we have just last week studied the transition of power, so to speak. Not really power in a kingly or political sense, but as far as the prophets go, the transition of power. They did have their own power, authority. They do miracles. I mean, we're going to see that in this story tonight too. But anyway, from Elijah to Elisha, and we talked about last week and mentioned this several times recently in different Bible studies. It comes up a lot. But you can see in the Bible how important it is to have mentor-protege relationships, and how often discipleship is done that way. You can do discipleship in large groups and small groups, but I definitely think it's extremely effective when done one-on-one. We can see it in the New Testament very significantly, even with how Jesus mentored Peter. He had the big three, Peter, James, and John, but he spent probably most of his mentoring energy on Peter, and he even told Peter he'd be the one that the church would be built on, as Jesus being the foundation of the church as well. Peter and the other apostles would be the first floor, so to speak, and Peter was even first among them. We see with Paul and Silas, Paul and Timothy, Paul and Titus, Paul and Barnabas, Paul and Luke, Paul and everybody. He mentored so many people. We see it with Moses and Joshua. And we talked about when we studied the book of Judges how odd it was that there was no transition of power. There was no protege under Joshua. And that's really one reason why it says over and over again, there was no king in the days of Israel. There was no one leader. So the fact nobody took Joshua's place is one reason why Judges goes off the rails. But even outside of that, it seems to be obvious. And you could even say this is true outside of Christianity, but just one-on-one mentor-protege relationships are just so amazing. I had that in Chicago with David Poteet as being the protege, and I have that now with Dustin at Bear Point, and that's going so well. We definitely, we have some real conversations, and we don't always agree on everything, and he's challenged me to think of things and do things differently. But it's so good. You can tell that from our sermons. I talk about him a lot, and he references me a lot. It's just because this is something that has just become a big part of Bear Point, and everybody is important. Every volunteer we have is important. But I'm very thankful that our church has a young man who can give you a different voice and different views and enthusiasm. He preaches typically more enthusiastically than I do, and that's very good for our people. And this past Sunday was a beautiful example of how powerful it can be when a church allows multiple voices, when they're good voices and well studied, and to preach and to teach. And of course, we get that, from Sunday schools and different other studies as well. But Elijah in this story has just, he's gone up to heaven. He didn't really die, so to speak. And he's transferred his power, his authority to Elisha. And Elisha is going to begin his ministry now. And so verse 19 of chapter 2 says, "Now the people of the city said to Elisha, 'The location of this city is good, as my Lord sees, but the water is bad and the land is unfruitful.' He said, 'Bring me a new bowl, put salt in it.' So they brought it to him. Then he went to the spring of water and threw salt into it and said, 'Thus saith the Lord, I have made this water wholesome. From now on, neither death nor miscarriage shall come from it.' So the water has been wholesome to this day, according to the word that Elisha spoke." And what we can see from this is primarily, and there are many things I'm sure we could see, but the one thing I'll point out is that, and we're going to see this over and over and over again over these next few chapters, is that Elisha does a lot of miracles. Again, he has the power of God. We could even say the power of the Holy Spirit, I think would be accurate to say, to break the laws of science and nature. And this is something that Elijah and Elisha and many other prophets, and we see with the apostles in the New Testament, and Jesus himself, something that proves the power of God is on someone. And now, of course, you do see false prophets, and other people that do have some kind of power like this sometimes. Okay, so there is, like when you read the story of Exodus, how the magicians for Pharaoh were able to duplicate some of the plagues that God worked through Moses and Aaron. But typically speaking, though, when you see this kind of power, it comes from God. And there are exceptions. Jesus even said, in Matthew 7, there are going to be people who did miracles that are going to stand before him one day and say, Lord, Lord, and he's going to say, "Depart from me, I never knew you." But when you read the Bible, it's easy to tell who is truly a follower of the living God and where that power comes from. And so the first thing we see is, again, his ability to change water just by putting salt in it. And I don't think this was something that would have had to happen naturally. I do think this is a miracle. That's really the point of this story, is that at the very beginning of Elisha's ministry, we can see that just like Elijah, he has power, again, that can only come from God to again, do things that naturally should not be able to happen. And so we're going to see this. I don't want to get too far ahead, but this is pretty important. In Elijah and Elisha's life, we definitely see that both of them do miracles that point to Jesus, and especially Elisha. Because in Elisha's case, not only does he raise a boy from the dead, just like Elijah did, which points to Jesus doing that with 3 people that we know of, possibly more. We know of at least 3, Jairus' daughter, widow's son at Nain, and Lazarus. And that all that ultimately points to Jesus rising from the dead. But we also see in Elisha's life, in chapter 4, he is going to multiply food to feed 100 people. And of course, Jesus did it to 5,000. So Elijah and Elisha point to Jesus, but we still see that Jesus is greater than them, even in the miracles that he did. We know of Naaman in chapter 5 that Elisha is going to heal a leper. That absolutely should point to Jesus. But all of these miracles that Elijah and Elisha do weren't just, demonstrations of God's power, but they were supposed to get people's hearts and minds ready for the Messiah to come. And I am positive, as I've said many, many times in my time at Bear Point, when in the New Testament, when Jesus was doing these things like multiplying food to feed 5,000, and whenever he was raising people from the dead, the Jewish people, and even perhaps some Gentiles who knew the scriptures, would have said, "Oh, wow, this is what Elijah did or Elisha did." Now, interestingly, in the New Testament, we don't find anybody ever saying, to my recollection, he must be the second coming of Elisha, but we do see people saying that they thought Jesus was Elijah. Jesus even asked his apostles, "Who do men say that I am?" And Peter said, "Some say that you are Elijah, the second coming of Elijah. But that was because Elijah and Elisha both did things that were miraculous that Jesus also did. And of course, Jesus did them even more significantly. Instead of feeding just 100 with multiplied food, he fed 5,000. Instead of just raising one person from the dead, he raised 3 that we know of. And so these miracles that that Elisha does should remind us of Jesus. Remember, everything in the Old Testament, every book, every chapter, every syllable should point to Jesus Christ. It does point to Jesus Christ, and we should see it that way. Reading on further, it says, so he went up from there to Bethel, and we've seen a lot of Bethel in these 2 chapters so far. Bethel, again, was one of the places that Elisha went with him, and that we saw that from last week, how discipleship should take place as we're going. We don't have to just do discipleship on Sundays and Wednesdays inside the church building. Discipleship should be an everyday, everywhere, Jesus exalting, community-focused thing. I take Liam to the mailbox to mail thank you cards, or I take him out, shoveling or whatever when it snows. That's discipleship. Okay, it absolutely is. And we always try to talk through, and again, we have plenty of failures here as parents. I don't want to ever, paint any different picture than that. We have the exact opposite of a picture-perfect life here. We have a lot of problems and issues, but we do try to talk to our children about, especially Liam being older, about why we do what we do based on the Bible, not because we're good people, okay? But Elijah and Elisha traveled places together. Bethel was one of them, and they just did life together. Before Elijah went up to heaven in the whirlwind, he and Elisha were like that. They did everything together, and I'm positive even the daily, trivial, menial, boring stuff they were doing together. That's discipleship. We don't see that just with parenting. Again, there have been times Dustin and I have gone to a basketball game, or we've gone to eat Mexican food, and that's discipleship too. Everything we do is not just talking about the Bible or the preaching schedule or just accountability. It's everything we do. So we see that from Elijah and Elisha's example, and the Bethel reminded me of that. And while he was going up on the way, some boys came out of the city and jeered at him, saying, "Go away, bald head, go away, bald head." When he turned around and saw them, he cursed them in the name of the Lord. Then 2 she-bears came out of the woods and mauled 42 of the boys. From there, he went on to Mount Carmel, and there returned to Samaria. Now, that sounds like a very graphic, and it is a graphic story. It sounds cruel, almost like, God killed these boys, it says in my translation, almost, unnecessarily, because all they did was taunt Elisha. But again, I really think if you understand this more in the time and context in which it was written, it wouldn't seem cruel or unnecessary at all. It's highly likely the word boys is used in this passage for people who were a lot older than, like, say, Liam, or even 9 or 10 years old. It was used for men who were young adults. And so I think it's highly likely that this was probably a roving gang of troublemakers, people that really could hurt or kill him. And I really think by taunting his bald head, I really think they were speaking against him personally. And again, Elisha was God's anointed. And so what they were doing was, I do think that they were in a position where they were going to hurt him. And so I think God using Elisha to react in such a way that he cursed them, and they were mauled by two female bears, I think is totally justified. I really think if we'd have been there in the moment, and I don't even know if Bear Point people struggle with this. I may have said this before, but I spent a lot of time in my first ministry around people who just got so upset anytime the Bible gets violent about anything. Why did God have to destroy, Canaan and all the children and women? And some of those questions are good, but I do think if you really understand everything in the original context, it makes a lot more sense. And then there are times where God does things and maybe they don't make sense to us, even in the original context, and that's okay too. But I do think it's very justified here, and that these boys, this was probably more like a gang, and they were bad news and they were trouble, and so God was justified, as he always is, in having Elisha curse them and kill them. So chapter 3. In the 18th year of King Jehoshaphat of Judah, Jehoram, son of Ahab, became king over Israel and Samaria. And this is the second son of Ahab to be king. Ahaziah was the first one. And if you recall, if you've been following along, Ahaziah died because he did not put his trust in God after he fell through the lattice window. And God had promised Ahab that he would stamp out his family line, which happened to 3 kings, Baasha and Jehoram, Jeroboam, first, back in earlier in 1 Kings. This is the third king because of his wicked deeds to have his family line stamped out. But God told Ahab because he repented, or not because he repented, but because he confessed and he mourned his sin, that God would not stamp out his family line in his lifetime. So it happened in the lifetime of his sons. But his sons, two of his sons, did get to become king, and Jehoram is one of them. Or Joram, it might say in your translation. He reigned 12 years. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, though not like his father and mother, which would be Ahab and Jezebel. Oh, Ahab and Jezebel. The effects of their reign of terror, keep going on and on. For he removed the pillar of Baal that his father had made. So, this king, Jehoram, is not a good king, but he's also not nearly as bad as his father was. Or his brother, who was even worse than Ahab in some ways. Nevertheless, he clung to the sin of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, going back several generations. And again, he was not related to Jeroboam. But the way he lived was, again, very reflective of that. And we can even see how easy it is to pass sin from generation to generation, even outside of families. When one nation, commits a certain sin, it's very easy to see that sin passed down, again, throughout the whole country or the whole nation, and not just, through families, through fathers, sons, grandsons, and all that. Which he caused Israel to commit. He did not depart from it. So again, we can see that in the northern kingdom, there really are no good kings. They're basically all bad. Some of them are worse than others. The southern kingdom has a lot of good kings, or at least a few. People like Jehoshaphat and Hezekiah and Josiah. So verse 4. Now King Mesha of Moab was a sheep breeder, who used to deliver to the king of Israel 100,000 lambs, and the wool of 100,000 rams. But when Ahab died, the king of Moab rebelled against the king of Israel. And so now he sees an opportunity, even though he had an alliance, so to speak, or an agreement at least, with Ahab. Now that Ahab's dead, he is going to wage war. So King Jehoram marched out of Samaria at that time and mustered all of Israel. As he went, he sent word to King Jehoshaphat of Judah. The king of Moab has rebelled against me, and will go with me to battle against. Will you go with me to battle against Moab? He answered, I will. I am with you. My people are your people, and my horses are your horses. Then he asked, by which way shall we march? Jehoram answered, by the way of the wilderness of Edom. And now, if you remember, a few chapters ago, all the way back in 1 Kings, actually, whenever Ahab was getting ready to go fight against Aram, the Arameans, he did a lot of very similar things here. He called in Jehoshaphat, and he had a kind of alliance with him, an agreement, a partnership, so to speak. And he wanted him to join him as he went to fight against the Arameans. The same thing's going to happen here. It's not Ahab this time; it's his son. But like father, like son, now his son is going to try to get Jehoshaphat to come join him, and this time it's Moab instead of Aram. But we're going to see a lot of similarities in this chapter between chapter 22 of 1 Kings, and how Ahab handled the war against the Arameans, and how Jehoram handles the fight against Moab, who is now going to rebel against him. So it says, oh, by the way, notice that little verse too. I just wanted to point this out. I don't know if this is really supposed to mean anything, but it says, Jehoshaphat said, he answered, I am with you. And Jehoshaphat says, my people are your people, my horses are your horses. I don't know if this is supposed to remind us of those verses in Ruth, where Ruth tells Naomi she's not going to leave her or depart from her, because she says, your people will be my people and your God will be my God. But that reminds me of that. It must be in the Bible and then in their culture, a way of, again, just, communicating, like a covenant relationship. And I've even heard people use Ruth's words in weddings before, even though Ruth was speaking to her mother-in-law, and it was not a husband to a wife or a wife to a husband. I've seen people use that statement from Ruth. Your people will be my people. Wherever you go, I'll go. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. So again, these type of statements show, again, a very strong, relational commitment that I think Christians really are supposed to have. Granted, I don't think Jehoshaphat necessarily had to have this relationship with the king of Israel. I think that's unhealthy. We're going to see that later on. But these are, again, statements, though, that communicate to us how important relationships were in the Bible, and even especially between kings. And in Ruth's case, between mother-in-law and daughter-in-law. when they both were widowed. So the king of Israel, the king of Judah, and the king of Edom set out. And when they had made a roundabout march of 7 days, there was no water for the army or for the animals that were with them. Then the king of Israel said, Alas, the Lord has summoned us 3 kings only to be handed over to Moab. But Jehoshaphat said, Is there no prophet of the Lord here, to whom we may inquire of the Lord? And then one of the servants of the king of Israel answered, Elisha, son of Shaphat, who used to pour out water on the hands of Elijah, is here. Jehoshaphat said, The word of the Lord is with him. So the king of Israel and Jehoshaphat the king and the king of Edom went down with him. That should remind you of Micaiah from 1 Kings. And Ahab, again, Jehoshaphat did not want to go into war unless he had one of God's prophets, not one of the 400 yes men, not one of the 400 false prophets, telling Ahab, yeah, you go to war, God's handing this victory over to you. Jehoshaphat didn't believe that, and so he had the true prophet of the Lord, Micaiah, come in and tell the truth, and that was that Ahab was going to die. Same thing happens here. Jehoshaphat, same old Jehoshaphat, still very constant. Jehoshaphat's a very good king, not perfect, but very good. And he is still wanting to hear from God about this instead of just taking the king of Israel's word for it. And so Elisha said to the king of Israel, What have I to do with you? Go to your father's prophets or to your mother's. But the king of Israel said to him, No, it is the Lord who has summoned us. 3 kings only to be handed over to Moab. Elisha said, As the Lord of hosts lives, whom I serve, were it not that I have regard for King Jehoshaphat of Judah, I would give you neither a look nor a glance. And now imagine this. We've seen this a few times, but this is still significant to me. This is amazing. The king, who is the king, by the way? Okay, it's a divided kingdom. He's king over the northern kingdom. Son of Ahab, who was super powerful, and Jezebel, who was an absolute, holy terror as a queen. He wants an audience with the prophet, with Elisha. The real prophet, the true prophet, not a false prophet. And Elisha won't even talk to him. Could you imagine the anger? That's the scandal, the outrage, that Jehoram must feel that Elisha treats him this way. And then when Jehoram responds back, Elisha basically tells him, if it weren't for Jehoshaphat, the righteous king of the southern kingdom, being along with you, I wouldn't even give you the time of day. And again, this is, part of being a prophet of the Lord. Sometimes when you speak truth to power, it's not always going to be nice and easy. And there are times it's going to be sarcasm. And there's times where it's going to sound cruel and it's going to sound mean and it's not going to be nice. But I really think even in the modern times, there are times where, preachers have to do that, especially dealing with lost people. Especially people who want to use God for their advantages and they don't want to serve God or worship God with the totality of their life. How about that? That's what we see here. And you think people are doing that today? Absolutely. And I think it's, the church's responsibility to call that out. So Elisha said, As the Lord of hosts lives, whom I serve, were it not for I have regard for King Jehoshaphat of Judah, I would not give you neither a look nor a glance. Wouldn't give you the time of day. I would not even deign to come into your presence. I would not condescend to come to you face to face. And then he says something very interesting. But get me a musician. And then while the musician was playing, the power of the Lord came on him. Isn't that funny how music got Elisha in the proper mood to be able to, not even the mood, that's not even the most correct way to say it. It gave him the power to be able to prophesy. And I think there's something to that. I think it's definitely, I don't know about people like Dustin or Brother John or anybody else that's preached at our church, but I do find it easy to preach better if I listen to music ahead of time. Music has a way of stirring the soul, stirring the emotions, getting you fired up. Good worship song can absolutely just get you fired up. And in this case, it may even just been the music. Listening. Does anybody remember 2020 when we had the harpist come? I could listen to harp music or bagpipe music, especially Amazing Grace, and not even hear words, and it could still get me fired up. But this is what Elisha asked for. He asked for the music so he could receive the power of God to be able. This is the only time I can see this in the Bible. Music is used many times in powerful ways. We saw that in Jehoshaphat's story in 2 Chronicles, that he sent out the choir to fight instead of the warriors, and they just sang, and God caused the other army to find themselves in chaos, so God could win that battle. Music's always been very powerful, but we don't see many examples, I don't think, in the Bible of somebody needing music in order to get in the spirit, to prophesy. But that's what Elisha does here, and that's just a very relevant thing. It's a very modern thing to me too. I find a lot of similarities in my life. So, and he said, "Thus saith the Lord, I will make this wadi full of pools. For thus saith the Lord, you shall see neither wind nor rain, but the wadi shall be filled with water, so that you shall drink, you, your cattle, and your animals. This is only a trifle in the sight of the Lord, for he will also hand Moab over to you." Kind of plot twist there. I would really think with Elisha being so mean and so condescending to the king, that he would have told him that Moab is going to win. That's what the Aram won against Ahab, but again, God in his infinite wisdom and mercy sometimes allows wicked kings to win battles. God is constantly in control of this stuff, and it's mind-blowing how often wicked people win against other wicked people in the Bible, and that's exactly what happens here. "So I will hand Moab over to you. You shall conquer every fortified city and every choice city. Every good tree you shall fell. All springs of water you shall stop up, and every good piece of land you shall ruin with stones." The next day, about the time of the morning offering, suddenly water began to flow from the direction of Edom until the country was filled with water. So God used water, Old and New Testament, to perform miracles. Jesus walking on the water, the flood, all these things are proof, again, that God is completely control over the natural world. And verse 21, "The Moabites heard that the kings had come up to fight against them. All who were able to put on armor, from the youngest to the oldest, were called out and were drawn up in the frontier. When they rose early in the morning and the sun shone on the water, the Moabites saw the water opposite them as red as blood." Wow. "They said, 'This is blood. The kings must have fought together and killed one another. Now then, Moab, to the spoil,' thinking they're going to win. I have bad news for them. But when they came to the camp of Israel, the Israelites rose up and attacked the Moabites, who fled before them as they entered Moab, and continued the attack. The cities they overturned, and on every good piece of land, everyone threw a stone until it was covered. Every spring of water they stopped up, and every good tree they felled. Only at Kir Haresheth did the stone walls remain, until the singers surrounded and attacked it. When the king of Moab saw that the battle was going on around him, he took with him 700 swordsmen to break through opposite the king of Edom, but they could not. Again, because God had determined that the other three kings, the two kings of Israel and Judah and Edom, were going to win the battle. Then he took his firstborn son, who was to succeed him, and offered him as a burnt offering on the wall. And great wrath came upon Israel, so they withdrew from him and returned to their own land. This is already getting close to 30 minutes, so I'm not going to comment on those last two verses. We'll pick up with those next week, because there's a lot just in those last two verses. The child sacrifice, which we will talk about in detail. That's a big deal in the Old Testament. Sacrificing children, which is just so abhorrent to us, I know, but it happened. Molech was the god the Canaanites who received, child sacrifice, and God often proved that he did not require this, basically through the story of Isaac. But we'll get into more detail of that next week. And that last verse, if you're really paying attention, it says great wrath came upon Israel. Israel won the battle. And so why did great wrath come upon them? That's a very confusing verse, but we're gonna talk about it and interpret it and all that next week. And then we'll get into chapter 4. So if you have any questions or comments, please post them below, or if you want to contact me privately, you're welcome to do that. Prayer requests especially. We have a good, hearty prayer request time on Wednesday nights normally. Even if we don't have but a few people there's usually 15 or 20 prayer requests. And so I want to be praying for whatever is important to our people. And I have a lot of things I'm praying for now. The sheer amount of suffering in our community right now is astronomical. So, but if you want to communicate anything to me, even if you think I already know it, you can comment below or reach out to me privately. 773-595-5912. Most of you have that number, but if not, that's it. Or you can send a PM to the church page or my page or whatever. I love you all. We definitely will meet on Sunday, barring something majorly unforeseen. We will make sure everything's clear, and we will have church as normal on Sunday. And it'll be a great Sunday. I love you all. Talk to you soon. Bye.